The backhand is arguably one of the most frustrating and challenging shots to master in pickleball. So in this video, I'm going to show you the exact technique that you need to be using if you want yours to improve. To start, we're going to come in close and talk about the grip. So as you can see here, I have some markings on the grip of my paddle, and these are to designate where you should be putting your hand on the different types of backhands. Before I get into that though, I want to explain that we're starting off with the grip because this is the #1 mistake that I see players making on their backhand. And unlike other shots like your forehand and your serve, you really need a specific grip on your backhand if you want it to be good and you want it to be at the highest level. You can have a bad backhand with the wrong grip, but it's almost impossible to have a good backhand if you don't have the right grip. So what are the right grips? So as you can see here, I've marked where my index knuckle meets my hand. So this is the reference point that we always use when we're thinking about our grip for every single shot. So when I'm looking at my paddle and I'm thinking about my grip, I want to be lining up that part of my hand with the line that I have for you here. So as you can see on the paddle and on every paddle, there's 8 notches. So it's an octagon shape. There's a big notch in the center. There's a smaller one, an angled one on the side, and then there's one that's perpendicular to the center on the side. So the grip that we're using for most of our backhands in pickleball and most of our shots in pickleball is called the Continental, and hopefully you've heard of this grip. That grip is represented by this blue line. So as you can see, the blue line is in the center of the angled notch that is to the left of the big notch in the center. So to have a Continental grip, I simply need to line up that part of my knuckle with the center of that notch. So if I reference the Continental later in the video, just know this is the position that I am talking about. A lot of people say that the Continental grip is like you're shaking someone's hand. So when you pick up a Continental grip, it should be really easy to hold your paddle like this, where it's facing perfectly up and down. This makes it easy to switch back and forth from forehand to backhand. This next line right here is called the High Continental. So the High Continental is literally just slight rotation towards the side notch from the Continental grip. And you might be asking, why would you need to use something that's so slightly different? So the time that you would need to use this High Continental is on a topspin backhand drive. Sometimes from the back of the court, if you want to hit a one-handed backhand drive with topspin, you want to rotate your paddle a little bit more like this so that you can get that extra spin. It makes it easier to get spin when you're in this grip. And this green line right here, some players, not all, like to use this on their topspin drives because they get more topspin. Not necessary though. So as I'll show you later, there is a little bit of preference on certain shots, but the one grip that you have to have down is the Continental, which is the blue line in the center of this angled notch. So from the back of the court, there's 3 different types of backhands. We have the drive where we hit hard and low. We have the drop where we're trying to go in the kitchen. And we have the slice where we hit it hard with underspin. And depending on which one of those shots you're using, you want to be using one of the different grips that we went through. And I'm going to explain that more later. To start though, I want to go over the building blocks that affect all 3 of those backhands. So to start, we're going to go over the building blocks that affect all of our different backhands. And then later, we're going to cover the more specific things that affect each one individually. Before I get into that though, I encourage you to look down at the subscribe button. Right now, we're trying to become the first channel in pickleball history to hit 250,000 subscribers. So if you want to help us make history and grow the sport, make sure to subscribe. So the first thing that you need to understand, and one of the most important technical mistakes that players make, is that when you're hitting a backhand from the back of the court, you want your take back to be perfectly straight back behind the path you're trying to create with the ball. So what does that mean? If I'm hitting a flat drive, I want to simply take my paddle back right here. And you might see players doing a loop on their backhand that looks like this. But if you have issues with your backhand, this is maybe something that people learned from tennis that they've been doing for years. It's a lot simpler to simply take your paddle straight back and accelerate forward because there's less moving parts. So as you'll see throughout the video, keeping your backhand simple is one of the best ways to make it more reliable. If you have too much stuff going on with the take back, it might become hard to be consistent with it. So that was a topspin backhand. On a slice or a drop, it's the same thing. You just take it back with a slightly more open face. So on my drive, I'm probably taking back my backhand with the face of the paddle perpendicular to the ground, Whereas on a slice or a drop, it's going to be a little bit more open. But what stays the same is I take it straight back and then I accelerate forward. So you don't want any extra nonsense in your stroke. You want to go from your ready position and you want to take it straight back. This will make you way more consistent. And another thing to keep in mind is you want to take it back very quickly. You don't want to be waiting in this position too long, and then by the time the ball gets to you, you're not ready, right? You want to be here. The second you see you're going to hit a backhand, you turn your shoulders and you turn your hips. So what does that look like in real time? When I see the backhand coming, I turn my shoulders and I take my paddle back. If I want to do a slice or a drop, it looks like this. You might see people at the courts doing crazy loops like this. This is probably something they learned from tennis, as I said. So you don't need to be doing that to get a lot of power. You can still get 99% as much power taking your paddle straight back on your backhand and using your weight to go through the ball. The next thing you need to understand is you want your backhand to be as wrist-free as possible. So as I'm taking my paddle back, I don't want there to be much movement as I'm going back, and I don't want there to be much movement as I'm accelerating towards the ball either. So in ready position, when I wait here, usually I'm already in a continental, and if I'm hitting a drop, I shouldn't have to move my wrist at all from this position to when I take it back to when I hit the drop. So there's literally no wrist movement. And what that does is it gives you way more control because you don't have to be worrying about another joint that's moving to hit the ball. So depending on what backhand you're hitting, you might use a little bit of wrist after you hit the ball. So on my top spin, I kind of brush up a little bit, which I'll cover that more later. But on your take back, you want your wrist to be completely steady until you hit the ball. So I always come from my ready position, I set my take back, which is a little different from shot to shot, but my wrist is completely steady the whole time until I hit the ball. So I'm getting all that power from my shoulder and my rotation. I'm not using my wrist to flick it at all. If you are using a lot of wrist on your backhand from the back of the court, you're probably doing something wrong. With volleys, we use a lot more wrist. From the back, you want it to be very wrist-free. Just because we're holding the paddle steady doesn't always mean that we're tight though. So on our top spins and our drops, you want to be holding the paddle at around a 3 out of 10 in terms of tension. There's one backhand that I'll go through later where you need to be holding a little bit tighter, but on most backhands from the back of the court, you want to be holding the grip relatively loose and you want to keep your wrist steady. This is the combination that will give you the highest amount of consistency. The next part of the stroke you have to do right if you want a good backhand is you never want to be using elbow on your backhand from the back of the court. So using elbow looks like this. It's kind of like if you're throwing a frisbee, you're going to use that elbow to get your power. Well, on a backhand from the back of the court, that's not what we want because it makes us lose control and it messes up our contact point. So if your contact point isn't out to the side and you're hitting it out in front too much, it might feel more natural to be using your elbow for your primary source of power. But if you want to be controlled and you want to have consistently accurate backhands, you want to be hitting it out to the side and you want to be using your shoulder as your primary source of power. This applies on drops too. So I don't want any elbow on my drop and I don't want any elbow on my drive. All my power is coming from my shoulder and my body's either rotation or movement forward depending on which shot I'm hitting. So just know if you're back here in the court and you're hitting a backhand, you don't want to be using pretty much any elbow. Your elbow's not going to be straight. It should be bent a little bit, but you want it to be steady as you're hitting the ball. It shouldn't be hinging when you're going forward. You also don't want to be using much wrist, especially as you're going back. There is one time where you want to use a little wrist after the shot, which I'll go through later, but generally it's a very wrist-free and elbow-free shot. So the main reason that we're keeping our wrists and elbows more steady is so that when we're hitting the ball, when we get to our contact, the paddle is facing the way that we want it to. If I'm doing all this crazy stuff in the backswing, then it might be facing up, it might be facing left, it might be facing right. This minimizes the variable so that when I get to my contact point, my paddle is facing the right direction and the ball is going to hit the sweet spot. So you need to make sure it's facing the right direction and the ball is going to hit the sweet spot. The problem is if your paddle has a tiny sweet spot, it's going to be hard to tell if you're the one making the mistake or if it's your paddle. So if you feel like you're in need of an upgrade, I highly recommend checking out our paddle, the SWEETSPOT Pro. This is a great paddle to improve your backhand because of the sweet spot being larger. The fact that it's an elongated paddle, so it's a longer paddle, also helps with your backhand because it gives you more leverage when you're hitting the ball, so you don't have to swing quite as hard to get the same amount of power. The grip also has really defined contours that make it super easy to find the continental grip. So some paddles have square grips where it's almost impossible to figure out where the continental is. On this one, it's really easy because of the way that it's set up. It's more of a rectangle. We already have the SWEETSPOT Pro on sale for Valentine's Day, but if you use code SLICE at checkout, you'll get $20 off, which makes the paddle $99.99. So this is pretty much as low of a price you're going to get on a carbon fiber paddle that's this good. So if you really want to improve your backhand, highly recommend checking this out. So now we're going to go through the 3 different backhands from the back of the court and cover the different nuances between them. So the first we're going to cover is the drive. So when you think about a backhand, the first one that comes to mind is probably the one-handed backhand drive from the back of the court. A lot of players do this with 2 hands, but most players on the court prefer to do it with 1 hand. 2-handers are really hard to learn. If you want me to make a video on 2-handers though, make sure to comment below and I will. But the one-hander is a tough shot to get the hang of, and there's a lot of different parts to it. So when I'm hitting my one-handed drive, the first thing I want to do is turn sideways with my feet, and I want to turn completely sideways with my chest. You don't want to be hitting this with an open chest to the courts. It's pretty much impossible to not use too much elbow if you're hitting this with an open stance like this. So step 1 is to take my paddle back and to turn sideways facing towards the side fence of the court. And you also want to set your paddle like I talked about earlier. On this shot specifically, you should be setting your paddle with it facing perfectly up and down. So see how my paddle is perpendicular to the ground? It's not facing up and it's not facing down. What this does is it allows me to move towards the ball without having to adjust anything with my wrist. So my paddle stays completely level as I'm going towards the ball, and then I make contact with it out in front to the side of my body. If I'm making contact with this behind me like this, there's 0 chance I hit it well. So in order to make this contact point happen, I need to move my feet so I get into the right position. So what you want to do is you want to move with your paddle already back. You don't want to be moving and then slowly get into position as you're going towards the ball. When the ball is coming to you, the first thing you do, you turn and you move so that you get that contact point exactly where you want it. The next thing to understand on a backhand drive though, is that your grip and your wrist are a little bit different on this shot than any of the others. So on the examples that I was just showing you, I was using a full continental, but some players, not everyone, prefer to either use the high continental or the grip where you're fully on the side like we have a one-hander in tennis, because that gives you more topspin. So your backhand grip on your drive and on your slice might be different. I personally actually use continental, but if I'm using a high continental, it looks more like this, which gives me the ability to hit more topspin. So if you feel like you want more topspin, you might want to try the high continental grip or the grip where we're more on the side, because it's easier to brush up behind the ball like this. My advice to you though is to try the 3 different grips on your backhand, see which one you like best, and stick with it, because you can make it work with all 3 on a drive. You don't want to be the kind of player that's always messing around with their grip, trying to switch it around and get it better. Pick one in the beginning when you're learning how to do your backhand right and stick with it, and you'll be able to make it work. The next thing you want to think about is your wrist. So your wrist should not kick in on this shot until you're about to hit the ball. Right when you hit the ball, you can actually extend your wrist a little bit forward and up to give you that extra topspin. So a lot of your topspin is going to be coming from the fact that your arm is rising. You can give yourself a little bit extra by doing a windshield wiper motion, not a full motion like this, a slight windshield wiper motion, which is going to give you that extra spin. And you can go a little bit forward too, which will give you a little bit extra power. So it's very subtle, but if you want the most possible power and most possible topspin, that wrist right on contact will definitely help. But you don't need this to make the backhand work. So if the wrist is screwing you up and you don't want to be using it because it's making you too inconsistent, I can still hit a really good topspin backhand drive with only using my shoulder and only using my body to hit the ball. So this is sort of an additional thing if you have the control that you can add on. And in terms of rotation, you want to start off on a backhand drive facing sideways, and you want to finish facing forwards. So what that looks like, I turn sideways and I open up facing forwards. You don't need to go fully forwards to where you're facing the net, but you at least want a little bit of rotation, because that's a lot more reliable than getting your power from using your elbow or your wrist. You need that rotation and that shoulder to open up to be able to get that full power. So you start here, you finish here. So the next backhand we're going to cover is the slice, which is mainly used on the return. So I'm sure you've seen players hit a return like this where they're moving forward, and a lot of the time they're using a slice. So on a slice, you want the continental grip every single time. There's no different ones you should try. You should always have a true continental grip when you're hitting a slice. You also don't want to use any wrist. So as you can see, as I'm hitting this shot, all of my power is coming from my shoulder. There's no elbow, there's no wrist. I'm getting it all from my shoulder and my momentum through the ball. So the one thing that you can do differently on a slice than a topspin is it's okay if the ball comes a little more at your body. You have a little bit more room to adjust. I can still hit the ball if it's closer to me, but ideally, you want to be hitting everyone in that contact point out to the side. So you can sort of pull this off, but if you can, you should work with your feet to get it so it's out to the side of your body and a little bit out in front. So most of your power on the shot, like I said, is coming from your shoulder and your momentum through the ball, but you don't really want much of a rotation. So as you can see, I turn my shoulders a little bit, but I don't really open them up as I'm hitting the ball. I sort of keep them facing more sideways as I run through it, and I get plenty of power to be able to hit the ball deep by doing that. So this is a more steady shouldered shot. You don't want to be rotating too much. And a generally good tip for your return is that you want to be moving forward before you get to the ball. So sometimes it makes more sense to start from farther back, then as your opponent's hitting the serve, you start running forward so that you get to the kitchen faster, but you can also get power from that because your body's momentum is going forward. Now we're going to cover the drop, which could be the most important backhand that you need to know from the back of the court. And one of the main differences on the drop from our other backhands is when we're taking our paddle straight back, we should have the continental grip, but you might actually want to take it back lower because we're trying to hit our drops a little bit up. So the drop is kind of like a mini lob, and we want to get under the ball, and we want to hit the ball as it's falling. So as I'm taking my paddle back, you might actually want to get a little bit lower so that you can simply draw a straight line up through the ball to hit it. You don't want to come up higher, then lower it, because that just adds too many moving parts and it might make you inconsistent. So on your take back, remember, take it back lower, set it, and then go straight forward. You don't need all this movement on your drop. It's a very simple shot, but it's very accuracy based. So you want to minimize what's going on in the back. As I said, you want to have the continental grip and you want to have a super loose grip, and you don't want your wrist to be flopping around at all. So as I'm taking it back, I set my wrist right here and I only use my shoulder for power. So I'm really rocking through it and using my shoulder, and that's the only two ways I'm getting any power on the ball. The other thing that's different about this shot is my motion is way more compact. So on my top spin, I'm actually going to finish on the other side of my body. My slice is going to stay on this side of my body, but it's a little bit longer. My drop's really just right here. So what that looks like, I take my paddle straight back. I don't need to extend it farther, really, than after where I hit the ball. You want to go a little bit through it, but after that, the more swing I'm taking, the less control I have. So you don't really want to be taking a giant swing on your drops. On your drive, as I mentioned, you're going to be finishing up here sometimes. On your slice, there's more going on, but it's on the same side of your body that you start. Drop is right here. Out of these three backhands, make sure to comment which of them you struggle with the most so I can make more videos on that in the future. And if you want to watch the full scientific explanation about how to hit perfect third shot drops, watch this.